Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Keyboard Chronicles. This is a series meant to document my transition from playing fighting games on a controller to using a keyboard. A little bit about me. I was born in the 80s and don't remember a time period in my childhood where I didn't have a video game console. I rarely played computer games due to one simple fact. I far preferred a controller to a mouse and keyboard. I stayed with consoles up through the early 2010s until I started playing Left 4 Dead 2. I was hooked on the game, so much so that when I discovered all the custom campaigns available for the PC version, I took the dive into computer gaming. Eventually, due to console failures like the Yellow Light of Doom and the Red Ring of Death, I began exclusively playing games on the PC. It took some time to adjust to mouse and keyboard, but for first-person shooters, I found it helped my accuracy, and soon I preferred it to controllers for almost every genre except one: fighting games. The idea of playing fighting games on keyboards seemed absurd, but I struggled to find a good controller for the PC. Many of them would have a button or two become unresponsive pretty quickly. At the same time, I didn't really want to shell out the price of a full game to buy a PS4 controller, especially at this point having lost confidence in almost anything console, thanks to my personally disappointing experience with the 7th generation. So finally, almost on a whim, I decided to try and learn how to play fighting games using a keyboard. After all, I adapted to mouse and keyboard for games like Left 4 Dead, maybe it wouldn't be so bad for fighting games. And I have to say, it actually hasn't been. The novelty behind attempting to play a fighting game using a keyboard faded quickly when I learned how better to move about the environment, or how much easier it was to input attack combos using several fingers rather than depending almost entirely on a thumb and one other digit. Full admission, I am definitely not fully adjusted or comfortable yet. A game like Street Fighter, whose core gameplay involves 6 buttons, 3 kicks and 3 punches, is still something I have to work on, as much of my focus has been more on games that are traditionally looked at as having core mechanics featuring 4 base buttons. However, what I have adjusted to with the keyboard has been very enjoyable, and so we come to the crux of this series. I will be walking through several games that I practiced learning the keyboard on, and providing some gameplay of those titles while I narrate a bit of information on them along with any thoughts I have. To start out, the next video will feature the first fighting game I practiced on a keyboard with, Fantasy Strike. But for now, to close out this video, I'll leave off with the base keyboard configuration that I use for fighting games. This configuration can change depending on the title, of course, but generally I try to align my keyboard controls to this setup. To start with directions, the A button is used to move to the left and is controlled with my left hand's ring finger. The S button is used for crouching and is controlled with the middle finger. The D button is for moving to the right and obviously is managed by my left hand's index finger. Simple enough. One might think naturally that W is used for jumping, but I opted for something that many keyboard users do, and which emulates a hitbox controller. Rather than W for jumping, I use the spacebar and manage it with my left hand's thumb. I believe a lot of keyboard users use some variation of U, I, O, J, K, L, or any of the surrounding keys for the attack buttons, predominantly because it's a pretty comfortable and known position for the right hand when placed in home row location. However, I like to use the numpad personally. I like the separation of my hands, and I find the numpad easier to know where my fingers are in case I get slipped up and lose my digit placement. So with that in mind, numpad 1 is the first action button, and typically the one used to confirm in menus. You could think of this as the X button on a PlayStation controller. Numpad 2 is the second action button, and numpad 3 the third. Notice a pattern here? Numpads 4, 5, and 6 correspond with actions 4, 5, and 6. Basically, the attempt made for the action buttons is to emulate how the buttons are set up on an arcade stick. Altogether, here is the base keyboard layout that I use. In each video of this series, I will bring up a color-coded layout specific to the title in the video, along with a control key so that you can understand what buttons are related to what actions. I will note one final thing, and that's ghosting keys. Ghosting keys is when the keyboard ignores certain button combinations being pressed simultaneously. Ghosting is usually the result of keyboard manufacturers looking to cut costs. The keyboards they develop may only register so many key presses being used together, and the exact combination of keys being pressed and where they are on the keyboard can result in certain key presses failing to appear together. There are definitely some instances of this that manifest when using the numpad while playing fighting games. But with most newer titles, I am able to work around this by binding in-game macros to one of the other buttons not being used on the numpad. For example, Street Fighter 4's focus attack would be initiated by pressing numpad 2 and numpad 5 together. By themselves, this works appropriately, but if on my keyboard I am holding S, such as holding A and S together to block low when facing the right, and I attempt to counter a block string from my opponent by immediately using a focus attack, the keyboard fails to acknowledge numpad 2, unless I completely release my finger off the S key first. In the heat of a battle, I can't always guarantee that my brain won't go on autopilot and start my right hand pressing the action buttons for the focus attack, only after the left has stopped holding the down and back inputs. The result will be a medium punch, and likely something I'm not prepared to follow up on. But on the PC, Street Fighter 4 has the built-in option to map the focus attack to its own button, which I do by mapping it to numpad 8. More on that logic in later videos, but the takeaway here is that many modern fighting games have options to their controls that eliminate any major instance of numpad ghosting. Older games, not so much, but those are played more for novelty than anything else, at least for me. Guilty Gear, The Missing Link, for example, absolutely refuses to initiate the instant kill attack when using a keyboard. And while this is an example of something related to the game rather than my specific peripherals, lack of full support for keyboards is something pretty common in ports of older fighters. I think that about covers it for this introduction to Keyboard Chronicles. I'll be posting up the next video soon. Thanks so much for watching this.